I've been asked to create some guidance for the response to the Utah State Board of Education Standards and Assessment Committee for their draft of the gender identity guidance for Utah public education. This document is just incredibly concerning. So I hope you'll take the time to watch this, and then I can also provide some written suggestions on how to provide a response. This is an arduous process. They did not make it easy to respond, but it's well worth taking some time, and hopefully this video will help you to help guide you through the process. So this first screen we're looking at is what you'll get when you log into the link. And basically you just, this is due Monday, February 7th. So we need to get on this and get as many people responding with responses that will protect our children rather than this transgender ideology. So press the next button, and as you'll see, it'll ask you who you are and kind of what your interest is, whether you're a resident of Utah. After that, there's a link that you can hit on to get the draft of the document that they're proposing. And that's what I'm going to go through with you today. So as you go through this, the submission process, at each point, it will say, what do you think of this section? And my recommendation for each section is to say, no, I don't feel it's necessary, but yes, I have suggestions and feedback, and I'm going to give you some ideas today on what that feedback can be. So the first section is the disclaimer section. And this section is misleading. It says that the guidance contains information associated with federal and state law. And there is no settled law on this. They're drawing information from recommendations and suggestions put out by different governmental agencies, but there is no settled law on this. So the fact that they're suggesting that they're following guidance provided by the federal and state law is not true. So I would suggest just to push back on that and say there is no settled law on this, and we should be developing a policy to protect our children. The second section is background. And this is a concerning background. It says that the Utah State Board of Education recognizes that academic success depends on access to an educational environment that is safe, conducive to learning process, and free from unnecessary disruption. I couldn't agree more. However, they're going on to say that they want to create a respectful school environment and climate, treat students with respect and fairness regarding their personal feelings and ideology. And that's where it starts to get concerning, that if they're going to base an entire policy around a student's ideology and feelings. This is not really how policy should be developed. Then it goes on to say more students have been expressing transgender and gender nonconforming identities and need school support. Well, this is clearly an indication that it's a social contagion, and schools don't buy into social contagions. They shouldn't be endorsing, enforcing, or creating policy around what is essentially a religious belief system. Then it says, at the bottom, after saying all these things that schools should do, schools should accept a student's consistently asserted gender identity. This is problematic. We'll get into that a little bit further down, but I really want to push back on this idea that affirming a student's transgender identity is creating a safe, conducive, or disruption-free environment for either that student or the other students in the classroom. Having a student who is lying about their biological sex and insisting that those around them affirm their reality is not conducive to a good educational environment. Allowing a student to appropriate the opposite sex is not creating an environment that's safe, especially for girls. Allowing biological men into the bathrooms where they're going to be girls is not respecting the safety of that student. This is completely disregarding the those with faith-based prohibitions against being in the state of undress or using bathroom facilities of the opposite sex of people who are not related to. This is not treating students with respect or fairness. It is privileging one religious belief system over everybody else's. It's disregarding basic biology. So push back on that section. I would say replace the entire section with your comments. The other thing that really needs to be pushed back in this section is the concept that there are students who are transgender. Transgender is a personality or an identity someone's assuming. Nobody is inherently transgender. No child is born in the wrong body, and schools should not be reinforcing that mystical belief system that a child can be born in the wrong body. So anytime it says transgender, I would push back on that and say there is no such thing as a transgender child. There are children who are gender nonconforming, and there are children who are struggling with gender dysphoria, but those children are children who are choosing to identify as transgender. They're not inherently transgender, and a school should not be accepting the concept that there are transgender children, because that's opening the door. As soon as you accept that supposition that a child can be born in the wrong body, that there is such a thing as a child who's inherently transgender, then you've just accepted this ideology. And this is, again, a religious belief system, not based in fact, not based in science, and it's very damaging to the schools and the children who attend them, and to society at large. Students who, again, it goes on to say, students should have equal opportunity to fully engage in the school environment. I totally agree. A student who has adopted a transgender identity should be able to fully engage in the school environment as their biological sex. In the same way that a kindergartner who chooses to identify as a kitten for a day gets to fully participate in school, but nobody's going to affirm her identity as a kitten that day. So again, there oftentimes transgender activists will say the transgender students are not allowed to participate fully in school. Of course they are. They just have to participate as their biological sex. The next section is dress code and grooming standards. And I actually didn't find a lot of problems with this. It suggested that there be mostly gender nonconforming school policies regarding dress code and grooming standards, which I agree with. I think that it's important to have gender neutral policies or sex neutral policies. The one thing that it did suggest is that if a school traditionally requires boys to wear one thing and girls to wear another thing, that a child should be able to choose between the two. And I would suggest no, the student needs to adhere to the standards of the biological sex. Again, we can't have students asserting what is essentially a personality, asserting something about themselves that they want everybody to believe that isn't true. In the same way that if a teacher says, hey, students, I want you to line up from shortest to tallest, and we have a short kid go to the front of the line and say, I identify as a tall kid. Well, we don't do that because it doesn't make sense and it's not true. Or if we had a teacher who said, I want you to line up according to the first letter of your name, and we have a kid named Xavier get in the front of the line and say, well, I identify as Andy. Well, that's not how it works. And so we can't allow students to just randomly identify as something that they're not, and then require the schools to reinforce that. The next section is on facilities, and this is a very concerning section. Basically, it says that any student can identify as the opposite sex and gain access to facilities of the opposite sex. That includes, but is not limited to, locker rooms, restrooms, shower facilities, costume rooms, backstage areas, nursing officers, athletic training rooms. They say that they would allow this out of respect for privacy and safety concerns for the student who is identifying as the opposite sex, but just the opposite is true. They are putting other children at risk, both physically and psychologically, by adopting this kind of policy. It says students should have access to facilities that correspond to their consistently assorted gender identity. No student should be compelled to use an alternative restroom. Well, first of all, I don't know if you've seen lately, but there are hundreds of asserted gender identities at this point. So are schools really going to try to accommodate that? Are we going to have kitty litters in our classrooms because somebody identifies as having a feline personality or a feline identity? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but this is where it goes. And who's to say that a child having a transgender gender identity is valid, but a child having a trans species identity isn't? Again, it sounds absurd, but this is where it's going, because there's no such thing as being born in the wrong body. There's no such thing as a child who's transgender. And so if we force schools to accept the concept of gender identity, we've already seen hundreds of gender identities emerging. We have, gender non-fluid, agender, gender non-conforming, gender, I've heard, oh my gosh, I think there's like 100 of them. There's no way schools can accommodate all that. What if you have a student who says, that they're an exhibitionist, their gender identity is exhibitionist, and they only want to use a facility that's open for everybody to see? Again, it sounds absurd, but that's where we're going with all this, is the concept that a student's feelings and their asserted gender identity, AKA personality, should supersede the truth, reality, and the rights and protections of other students. And also the just being unrealistic about the idea that schools could provide accommodations for students based on their, innumerable gender identities. Schools don't have the option to do that. As more and more students are buying into this ideology, they're going to come up with more and more absurd gender identities, and schools aren't going to be able to accommodate that. So let's nip it in the bud now. Not to mention, this violates children's privacy rights and faith-based rights. There are religious prohibitions for some religions against being in a state of undress with the opposite sex people who aren't in your family. That's a violation of someone's religious freedom. We have, girls should not have to be in a state of undress around boys. And again, this is based solely on feelings. So any boy can adopt a gender fluid identity and be able to go in the men's bathroom when he wants to and the women's bathroom when he wants to be able to compete as a male sometimes and a woman sometimes. And again, we could even have potentially a gender associated with age. So we could have an 18-year-old who identifies as a 3-year-old girl who wants to participate in pre-K programs with other pre-K kids. Again, having feelings dictate identity rather than facts dictating truth is really concerning. And so there's this is a section that has to be pushed back against really hard, because if we don't push back against it, we're going to have cases like we had in Loudoun County where girls are sexually assaulted in their bathrooms. We're going to have girls developing urinary tract infections because they're afraid to go into the bathrooms. We're going to have girls skipping school while they're menstruating because they're embarrassed to go to school and share a bathroom with boys while they're menstruating. We have sex separated spaces because it was found that girls and women are not safe when they share facilities with boys and men. We fought hard for these spaces, and now they're taking them away. The next section is school records and student privacy. And one of the things that it says is schools should eliminate unnecessary gender markers. There is no such thing as a gender marker. There are places to mark a student's biological sex, but there's no such thing as a gender marker. And so to even bring that into the policy again is showing that this policy is steeped in this gender ideology and is buying into a religious belief system and incorporating that into the policy, which is a violation of our religious freedoms. So then we have a section that says a student's privacy should be respected and no information should be disclosed. Ideally, that would be true. We don't want our educators going around giving out important information about the students to other people, especially private information. However, in this case, what this means is that there could be a boy who's identifying as a girl, who goes into the girls' locker rooms, who goes on overnight trips with the girls, who competes as a girl, and the other parents and the other students aren't told this. So conceivably, a girl could be put in a room with an overnight accommodation during a field trip or during a sporting event, and be put in with a biological male and not know it. And that puts that child at huge risk. In addition, if this is also applied to staff and faculty, it means that a male who claims to identify as a woman could be housed in overnight accommodations with a bunch of girls, and the parents wouldn't know that. So again, by adopting this ideology, you are putting children at risk, and parents aren't even going to be aware of it. The next section is participation in educational programs and activities. And again, students with any variety of personalities or identities should be allowed to participate in educational programs and activities. However, that this should not be based on their consistently and sincere gender identity. There are programs that have been specifically set up to help girls gain entry into STEM programs. And now those programs can be infiltrated by any boy who claims to identify as a girl, basically undermining the whole point of having those programs. Again, it talks about the overnight trips that no student should be told if they're going to be housed with a student of the opposite sex. Parents won't know it. That overnight accommodations must be provided based on a student's gender identity. So this is very concerning. It's also just really concerning because this allows predatory behavior, and we need to protect kids from predatory behavior. And again, it's undermining truth and reality for kids. And schools should not be doing that. Anytime schools do that, it's incredibly problematic. That's the antithesis of what schools should be doing. It's unreasonable to prioritize one identity over others. And in this case, privileging them because they're getting special treatment based on their identity that is not extended to all the students. One of the things, again, this is part of the ideology trying to erase anything related to sex-based differences. And though in this case, I kind of agree with the concept. It says a student who is transgender girl who wants to run for prom queen should be allowed to do it. And then it says an alternative, schools may consider replacing prom king and queen with prom royalty. And though I am not a big fan of the whole concept of prom king and queen, erasing them is and replacing it with prom royalty is, again, part of this whole ideology, erasing mothers, erasing fathers, erasing daughters, erasing girls, erasing boys, and replacing them with gender neutral terminology. It's incredibly sad. I'm not a fan of the whole concept of prom royalty. I was the ugly duckling in school and I did not have dates for proms. And there's no way I would have ever been elected to be a prom queen. But it's this insidiousness of erasing the language and replacing it with gender neutral language that's harmful. Because it starts with something like prom king and prom queen, and it ends with something like mother and father becoming parents because we don't want to offend people, or daughter and son become children because we don't want to offend people. So it erases something, our roles that are very important to us. The next section is preferred names and pronouns, and it starts out by saying students may ask teachers and other school staff to refer to them by an alternative name or pronoun that does not align with those listed on their official school records. What does that mean, does not align? And so this is a section that claims to be using Department of Justice 2021 guidelines. And again, this is not settled law. They're being disingenuous by saying these are guidelines. This is not settled law. They do not have to follow this. And one of the ways that we can have some influence is if you have a child in a Utah school, is to say, you're going to sue if they enact this policy. Because at this point, it seems like the only thing that the schools are responsive to is lawsuits. It's just unfortunate because ideally their whole goal would be to be educating our children. And very concerning, it says an educator refusing to refer to a student by an agreed upon alternative name or pronoun can be considered for discriminatory conduct. So again, they want to penalize teachers. And consider, again, I've seen up to, I think it's 112 different gender identities listed. We've seen Z, Zem, Zir, P, Pi, Peer, Li, Lai, Lu. There's so many different preferred pronouns at this point that teachers are going to be spending all their time focusing on making sure they use the correct pronoun rather than teaching our children. The other thing is that as quickly as this is expanding, it's not inconceivable that there could be, the entire classroom could each have their own pronouns. That's not unreasonable to think. And according to this policy, they each should be called by their preferred pronouns. Well, that's going to be absolutely impossible for teachers to do. So why are we instituting policies that are unreasonable and make no sense? And that, again, embrace and reinforce this dangerous ideology religious belief. Again, this is no different than telling teachers that because there are some Christian students in their schools, that they have to say a prayer before all their tests, and that they have to provide crosses for all the students to wear. And any teacher who doesn't accept Jesus Christ as their savior is going to be recommended for disciplinary action. That's what this is saying. This is the same. This is embracing an ideology, or saying that we are all going to have to take time out during the day to pray to Allah, because some kids will be offended if we don't do that. And that's not how our schools are run. And as soon as we start running them like that, it means that they are pushing a state-sponsored religion rather than educating our children. In so many ways, this policy is just, it almost looks like they just went to a transgender activist organization and asked them to put together a policy. This is based completely and 100% on transgender ideology. And this is incredibly dangerous. So we need your feedback. This is a long process to go through. It took me about half an hour, and I already had notes to fill in. So it is a process, but we have to stop this from infecting our schools. This is a dangerous ideology. And for those of you who think it's just an innocuous, identity, it's just pronouns and a name and how they dress. No, there are studies that show that as soon as we start encouraging that behavior, encouraging a child to believe that they are something other than what they aren't, to create an alternative identity, as soon as we do that, it puts them on a pathway towards medicalization, towards puberty blockers, which retard their growth and development, towards cross-sex hormones, which permanently damage their bodies, towards unnecessary cosmetic surgeries, such as getting their breasts sliced off. This is the ideology. This is what we're embracing. The idea that children will be better off to kill who they are and become somebody else. And it is unconscionable that the Utah State Board of Education is considering this policy. It's still in draft form. We still have the opportunity to push back against it. Please take the time to submit a response.